too.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. The webinars are a little weird because we can't see or hear anybody but ourselves, the panelists.
But we can see the participant list growing, so we know you're out there.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody.
And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat to each other. Let people know where you're joining us from today, your role working with kids as a parent, social worker, teacher, caregiver.
Give it just a couple
Minutes
minutes.
before we get started here. Let a few more folks join us.
Perfect. All right, I just enabled the chat, so it should be good to go.
Thank you, Tovah, for doing
Yeah,
that.
of course.
All right, folks. I think that we want to get started. I welcome everybody that's here and want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar. So for folks that are trickling in late or who could not make it today, we will have this recorded and posted on our Kids Mental Health Pierce County website. This is a Kids Mental Health Pierce County webinar supporting our youth during the return to school. For those of you that don't know, Kids Mental Health Pierce County is a coalition of people and agencies in Pierce County that are joining together to address the growing behavioral health crisis among school-age children and youth. The amazing people and agencies in this coalition are dedicated and invested in our community to develop a coordinated, responsive behavioral health system to serve and support the youth and families and children right where they are at the right time, the best place with the best outcome for every family. A goal of today is to provide a forum of community support where we can learn from one another and these incredible presenters. We'll have the opportunity for questions and answers. You can use the question and answer box at the bottom or use the chat feature. We're going to save the questions until the end of the webinar, but we will get to those at the end. Gina and myself, the program coordinators of Kids Mental Health Pierce County, will be monitoring the chat and following up with those questions to support our presenters today. Their co-presenters, Tovah Denaro, uses she, her pronouns. She's an education and behavioral consultant at Innovative Behavioral Consulting, LLC. Tovah has provided specialized educational and behavioral services to youth, ranging from kindergarten to 12th grade. Tovah served as a special education teacher in Seattle Public Schools, as a behavioral health specialist and curriculum developer in Las Vegas, and district behavior specialist and PBIS coach for Federal Way Public Schools, the most diverse school in Washington State. Tovah found her passion developing relationships, building wraparound supports, and educating youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities within a multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS framework. From her experiences in the classroom and developing social and emotional learning curriculum in a variety of school districts, Tovah focused on changing and growing school climate and culture to aid in the support for all students and staff through positive behavioral interventions and services as an education consultant with an emphasis on building an efficient and results-driven system that meets the needs of our youth and families. I'm so excited to have Tovah partnering with Kids Mental Health Pierce County and her continued support. She's an incredible presenter, and we're so happy to have her here. Our other presenter is Dr. Chris Laddish, PhD, the clinical the Chief Clinical Officer of Pediatric Behavioral Health at Marybridge Children's and Multi-Care Behavioral Health. Dr. Laddish is a licensed clinical psychologist and pediatric neuropsychologist and joined Multi-Care in 1996. Dr. Laddish's areas of expertise include pediatric psychology and neuropsychology, brain injury, autism, neurodevelopmental disorders, and gender-affirming healthcare. Dr. Laddish serves on the steering committee of Kids Mental Health Pierce County and is a member of the Multi-Care Behavioral Health and Pierce County Behavioral Health Advisory Boards. She is passionate about improving health equity and access for all children in need of behavioral health care. Prior to joining Multi-Care, Dr. Laddish obtained her doctorate from Washington State University and completed internships and fellowships at the University of Washington and Stanford Schools of Medicine. Dr. Laddish resides in Renton with her wife and their 2 teenagers. And Dr. Laddish has been an incredible partner from the inception of Kids Mental Health Pierce County, and we are so excited to have the 2 of you presenting today. So welcome everyone, and we look forward to this webinar.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. We're definitely going to tag team this. And if you want to go on to the first slide, but the focus of today is really going to be supporting our youth as we move in to this new school year. And those of you on the webinar are well versed and are well aware of some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, but we hope to share some new light and some new concepts about how the COVID crisis has elevated the pediatric mental health crisis. So, in terms of our objectives, we want to describe the existing mental health crisis that we've landed in, and it's actually been going on for some time, predating COVID. I'll review some of those statistics. We want to help you identify key stressors that were experienced by youth and parents surrounding this mental health crisis and during the pandemic, and how that impacted mental health. And then finally, we will review the most important part of this presentation are some key strategies and resources that you can utilize in helping youth and teenagers move through some of these trying times. We've put a picture up here just in terms of some of the statistics that our teens are facing. We're seeing in general increased depression rates of anxiety, rates of suicidality. If you know kids, if you have kids, if you work with kids, you're pretty familiar with this. I would say, more kids than not are having some form of impact related to what's been going on in the past 2 to 3 years, if not longer. One phrase that I like to share, particularly with teens, because I think it can be meaningful, is that an atypical reaction to an atypical circumstance is normal behavior. And so I think we're all responding in a way that you would actually anticipate. It doesn't mean that it's not worthy of response and support. It does mean that we can normalize this a little bit for one another and for the youth that we're working with. Next slide, please. So let's start talking about the mental health status of our youth. And these were the numbers that we had, pre-pandemic. We knew that 1 in 5 children were experiencing some degree of impairment related to a mental health disorder or mental health condition. We believe those statistics are now elevated closer to 1 in 4. 1 in 10 were experiencing significant impairment, meaning, interference with their functioning, interference with going to school, how they were interacting and engaging with peers, reduced self-concept and self-esteem, et cetera. As I mentioned, we've seen increased rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And, just to kind of level set what I'm meaning about that, when we're talking about, depressive characteristics, we're talking about the physical changes in sleep, appetite, energy level, fatigue level. Some kids report stomach aches or headaches, so there can be an increased somatization overlay. We also see the emotional component of increased sadness. Sometimes it'll come out as irritability. That can be more common in boys and young men. We can also see the sense of having a shortened fuse or being hyper responsive, reactive to things. Kids having a tendency to want to isolate and withdraw. And then finally, the whole social aspect of it, which is withdrawing from other individuals, oftentimes not wanting to be engaged in other activities, or reporting that they're engaging and they're just not having as much pleasure or interest in what they're doing. So that constellation of things coming together is really how we think about children who have depression. With anxiety, it's more along the lines of hypervigilance, fearfulness, can be symptoms of phobia. Kids can be more reactive to things. They may report physical sensation of a heightened heart rate. They may feel like they're getting short of breath or that they're having a hard time catching their breath. And certainly a predominance of worries and being potentially more worried about things than they generally would be. And we'll talk about how the pandemic has contributed to that in all of us. We also know that there have been access challenges. Prior to the pandemic, only about 1 in 3 children who is in need was receiving services. And as you may have read in the recent Surgeon General's report, it's estimated that it's about an 11-year wait on average from the time that symptoms are noted before children actually either seek or are able to access services, which is just staggering. It's particularly worrisome when you think that about half of all serious adult psychiatric conditions start by about age 14, if not sooner. So we can go on to the next slide. I really want to get into sort of some of the heart of the pre-pandemic data. I like this slide, and you can just kind of click through, Tovah, if you don't mind. If you look at the arrows, what you're seeing here, so this is 2004 to 2017. And I like this slide because it really kind of takes us pre-pandemic about what was going on in kids' lives and what we were seeing. And what I find fascinating is that right around 2011, 2012 is where we really started to see an uptick in depression rates for kids. And so I really, have been scratching my head and thinking, well, what is that about? What was going on at about that time? And the first thing I looked into was, well, what was going on environmentally for kids? And when you look into the social media, you can see that we had about a 4 or 5 year increase of applications that kids had access to. And they were not particularly helpful. Those of you that are old enough to remember, like myself, may recall actually that one of the first social media apps that came out, believe it or not, was called Hot or Not, and encouraged individuals to post a picture of themselves online for others to actively make comment about whether that individual was hot or not socially. And it kind of took off from there. Those of us that have looked through social media, work with kids around social media, are very clear that there can be very positive things about it, but there also can be challenging things about social media. And certainly social media in many cases is not necessarily reality. I feel that when you look at sort of 2010 to 11, you can really see that the applications also started focusing more on kids. We had Instagram, Snapchat. There was the year of the selfie in 2013, and it's kind of gone and evolved from there. When you put that against, and you can see I had a prompt to myself to remember to go over the cell phone rates for kids around these years. I think this is doubly worrisome and certainly of note when we think about these applications coming about and kids access. So in 2004, it's estimated that roughly 45% of kids between the age of 12 and 17 had cell phone. In 2006, that increased to 63%. By 2011, 3/4 of kids, or between 75 and 80% of kids, had a cell phone. So we're seeing these, unregulated or dysregulated social media apps that are being put out there, as well as cell phones getting into younger and younger hands with not necessarily the emotional or the cognitive capacity to really weigh and manage what they are being exposed to. This is sort of correlational data. It's by no means something I'm taking from a publication or any research that I've done, but the data is out there, and I think that it's worth all of us knowing for and thinking about the impact of social media and how our kids are feeling. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're becoming more aware of is related to our Healthy Youth Survey that is put out through the schools. In 2018, the Brookings Institute noted that mental health challenges had bypassed physical challenges to be the most prevalent disabling condition in children, surpassing cancers, diabetes, obesity, which is just striking. And I think it only bodes more for why we're having these meetings and how we so quickly landed into a mental health crisis after the pandemic. I think it just sort of tipped us over the edge. But the things that we were noticing even pre-pandemic is that 17 to 20% of high school students were reporting that they had considered suicide within the past 12 months. 14.5% had actually gone so far as to make plans to do so, and a staggering 8 to 9% of kids had reported actually having one attempt or more. And again, this was pre-pandemic. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then we know what started happening, and you can just toggle through this COVID if you don't mind. You know, COVID hit, and what did it do? It pulled kids out of school. It made them become more isolated. We saw increased fears of the threat of illness for parents, grandparents, other individuals. You know, we didn't know a lot about COVID initially, and people were feeling quite fearful about what might happen. In the context of that, we had far worsening of our geopolitical climate, both from the standpoint of climate change, as well as social politics, racism, you know, you name it, and we were struggling with it. And I think for kids, this was particularly worrisome because there was really no place to take it. You know, for a good portion of the onset of some of this, they were not in school. Many didn't have the resources to really pull it together for online school. And when we talked to teachers as they were coming back to school and asked, what do you need? How can we help with some of the learning challenges and the issues kids are facing? We heard overwhelmingly, oh, we'll manage the learning. We need help with their mental health. And it was really obvious that our kids were getting hammered. The slide below, the COVID image, really speaks to the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of teenagers, comparing boys as well as girls. There was not data on non-binary individuals, but we know that LGBTQ individuals and children of color were certainly impacted significantly by these issues as well. So I'll give you a minute while I'm talking to just kind of digest these statistics. But clearly you can see anywhere from, 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 or more were experiencing some form of change in their mental health or exacerbation of a pre-existing mental health condition related to the pandemic. And I bring that up not because, the pandemic has passed or that it's no longer with us, but because this really set a stage for us that I believe we're only starting to fully appreciate. And I think we're going to be dealing with actually for quite some time. I will say that I have 2 teenage kids, and my own sense of them is that they are both a fair bit behind socially, just related to a lot of the things that they missed out on while going through the pandemic. Now, my household may not be whatsoever the same as yours, but I definitely notice anecdotally just the things that they seem to be sorting through in their early college years are things that I would have thought they would have dealt with in high school. And then it kind of struck me that, well, they weren't really in high school much of the time. Next slide, please. All this continued to move throughout the year of 2020 and 2021. And actually by 2021, we had documented so much of an increase in kids presenting to the emergency rooms related to challenges with suicidality, depression, anxiety, that there was no missing that we were in a profound pediatric mental health crisis. Those that work in the field of mental health would have liked to see this strong barrage of attention happen more around 2012, 2013, when we were really seeing the mental health issues uptick, but we'll take it for what it is. I see the attention as one of the silver clouds of, or the silver linings to the cloud of the pandemic. Together conjointly, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Children's Hospitals Association, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry came together and formally declared a national pediatric mental health crisis in October of 2021. And that was very quickly followed after by the US Surgeon General putting out his impact paper about protecting the mental health of our youth. And we have a resource of that in our talk today. I'm going to let myself catch my breath and turn it over to my colleague Tovah to kind of go over some of the specifics that were found in the Surgeon General's report.
Thank you, Dr. Ladish. So what was just talked about really is that mental health piece pre-pandemic, and then knowing that the pandemic and all the socio-political issues that came alongside the pandemic really exacerbated the challenges that we are seeing with mental health with youth. And so last December 2021, Surgeon General actually put out a youth mental health advisory warning, really stating that the mental health of our youth is at an all-time crisis, and we really need to start considering how are we supporting youth that we work with, youth that we support, youth that we live with. And so one of the things that came out of that, the mental health advisory, is really looking at the factors that are shaping the mental health of young people, right? And we have to consider that individual piece, right? Their age, their genetics, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and then also starting to recognize what are the systems that are also supporting or that are at least an integral part of the youth that we are working with, right? So considering the family systems, the community systems, the environment, right? Society. I do a lot of work in Central and Eastern Washington, where for the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen a significant decrease in gang violence within the community. And then COVID hit, and we have seen the biggest increase in gang violence within youth that we have ever seen before in the Yakima Valley. And a lot of this has to do with that isolation that youth were feeling, right? Not knowing who to connect with, having a hard time recognizing the familial support that they would often have previously, and now they're in this isolated social bubble. And so youth really seeking out support in ways that is more maladaptive or less healthy than what we would expect and what we would want them to see. So just really considering all of these different aspects or all of these different systems that are playing a role in the child's life that we are working with or supporting. And you're muted.
I was trying to make sure we didn't have feedback. Thanks for telling me. So we want to talk a little bit about how our children are coping and also how we can help with their coping. Those of you that have attended our webinars before may be familiar with the Youth Engagement Services, or what's called YES, which is a part of Kids Mental Health Pierce County involved with the school districts. And one of the ways we have our Healthy Youth Survey, we also have now data that we're getting out of youth engagement services in terms of what kids are being referred for additional support related to. And I apologize, the colors kind of bleed together. I can give you sort of the high level data, and you can see it here yourself. I mean, we start with the biggest chunk, 65% is related to depression and anxiety, moving into trauma, kids who have multi-system involvement and yet are still continuing to have significant challenges and need more of a coordinated approach. And it goes on from there. But the vast majority of kids are having depression, anxiety, and I would say suicidal concerns that are being referred to us. Next slide. So as we've started to gather data and looked at the impact of COVID on the mental health of youth, some data is starting to come out. And these are some of the, just one review article that was published early on, looking at, how our kids are struggling and or thriving. Some of the high noted details was that now it seems closer that 1 in 4 are struggling with mental health concerns, that 10 to 30% of our youth are reporting anxiety and or depressive symptoms. Many are struggling with reduced sleep quality. And key contributing factors to changes include the, fear of illness that onset early, as well as just the impact of the extreme social isolation and the many threads that go along with that. The way I think about it is that we put on kids' plates potentially the most, stressful time they could be going through, and we removed, intentionally for their protection, but the vast majority of the coping strategies they had by taking them out of school, away from their peers, and putting them in an isolated circumstance. The recommendations that came out of this particular study were that we really need to focus on the sleep habits of our kids and make sure that they have good and adequate sleep and sleep hygiene, that they continue to engage in regular physical activity, and that we regulate their internet use. As kids have started to journey back to school, it's been interesting that we've kind of heard with masking and with the changes in requirements for masking that some kids haven't wanted to remove their mask. For some kids, we're hearing that it may be related to continued fear and anxiety. Kids who are prone to anxiety may have fear of illness, but a majority of them are also really not wanting to deal with the social uncovering that comes, or social revealing of taking their masks off. So for any of you that are online listening in the chat, I'll be curious after we speak if you're noticing that, and if you are, how you are addressing that. Strategies that have been mentioned, there was a New York Times article that came out in March talking about this, and really, suggested that we don't want to really push on that too much. It is something that we can talk to kids about. We can understand why they're wanting to keep their mask on. I don't necessarily think that it's helpful to force a child to remove their mask, and it would not be something that I would do in front of other students. It's more something that I would use as an inroad to a conversation about, I noticed you're wearing a mask, even though, we don't need to be masked. Are you sick? How are you feeling about having a mask on? And to open up the door to that. Next slide. I also want to talk about the sustained high intensity stress that our kids have been under, and the impact that it has had on us. So most of you that are on the line have probably heard the term fight, flight, or now we talk about fight, flight, or freeze. And when we look at the impact of sustained trauma, the biggest body of literature comes from our veterans, right? And we all know about post-traumatic stress disorder. But even within children and adults, when we're under an enormous amount of stress, we present an elevation in a natural body hormone that we have called cortisol. Cortisol is referred to as the stress hormone, and it helps us bring our body online in a way to avoid a threat. So if you saw a child running out in the street, what would allow you to alert and run and do exactly what you needed to do without thinking would be your kicking in of cortisol that dilates your pupils and increases your blood pressure and gets you ready to just launch into whatever you need to do. But what if the stressor isn't rapid and quick? What if the stressor is a year or more and pervasive and continues to happen? What if you have that level of high intensity cortisol in your system and you're constantly sort of on guard for something like that? Well, that's not a natural circumstance for our bodies, but it's where we land. And what you see over time is that we can be in a prolonged state of stress where we have secondary effects of trauma for those elevated rates of cortisol. And so we've got now a whole cohort of kids that may be experiencing increased fatigue, hypervigilance, hyperresponsiveness, feeling of cognitive dulling or cognitive slowing. These are all impacts of hyper levels of cortisol on the body's system. With young kids, you may see from a physical perspective that they might report they're feeling dizzy. They may breathe more quickly, or they may be prone to panic attacks or what looks like a panic attack. They may get hot or sweaty or report that they have muscle or body tensions. They may get shaky. They may report butterflies in their stomach. GI changes are not uncommon with excess cortisol in the system. general feelings of feeling scared or nervous. And the important thing to understand about that is that is more than just a behavior. It really is a biological and psychological response to pervasive trauma. And our response to this may vary based on our individual coping mechanisms. And so we'll talk about strategies as we move through this today about how you can work with kids when they are in sort of that fight, flight, or freeze area to kind of help bring them down, help them get focused, or help them get a break. And or distract themselves so they feel that they can continue moving through their day. Next slide, please. I like this slide because in young and older children, you know, that responsiveness really can feel to us like something's taken a hold of us and we're just being pulled along for the ride. Or you may notice that in students and kids that you work with, that they're gone. They're already off in the fear or the anger or the outburst or whatever it might be, as if they've been literally hijacked by their emotions. And that's really what we're trying to work against. And I love this slide, you know, the moment that he realizes he has no idea what he's mad about, because there is that sort of chemical influence that you just realize you're angry and you're not really sure what it's related to, or you may relate it to whatever is the closest thing to you, and it's really about something else. And I like to say to parents, you know, parents and school teachers for sure, if you're in the line of sight when this is happening, you may often get the blame for it, though you often are not the blame. Next slide, please. Other things we may see, and this is commonly experienced, right? We may have children shutting down. I think it's important to appreciate that with really young kids, they'll communicate in the manner that's most easily accessible to them. So that's likely not to be putting their feelings into words. It's more likely to tantrum, scream, strike out, lash out, because that is predictable. They're easily able to put it together. And it doesn't force them to bring their cognitive frontal skills online at a time when they're having increasing stress. There also resort rather to pleasurable or fun or avoidant activities versus challenging activities because it's just too hard in that moment. And then, as I said earlier, they may attribute blame for an emotion to the most immediate potential cause, you know, oh, it's because of the dog, or it's because of something the brother did, when it may be really to just this increased stress and cortisol and biochemical changes that have been going on for a very, very long time that the child doesn't have the ability to really put together and factor in. Next slide, please. In terms of coping, in a short moment, I'll be handing this off to Tovah, who's really going to go into great detail about some of the strategies. But I like to think about a few things that we can do. You know, one is creating predictable routines for unpredictable situations. What I mean by that is, if we've learned anything, it's in the past 2 years, it's that the only thing we can count on is change. That there will constantly be change and we know it's going to come. So how can we set up a situation where children have something that can be predictable, or teenagers, when a change happens that feels like it derails them? Is there a coping strategy that they know that they turn to? Is it 3 deep breaths and I go to the corner? Is it, you know, I sit for 5 minutes before I have to transition into the new thing? You know, is there a phone call they make? Is there someone that they speak to? I think it's very helpful to have in place what I do when change happens and sort of takes me over. So think about how we can have predictable routines, even in unpredictable situations. It's also helpful to create flexible structure, meaning, you know, we're going to do these things in these ways today at school, but we're also understanding that we might not all be our best selves, and we're not going to be rigid about it. Within reason, we can kind of move through the day and allow a little grace here. Offering cognitive activity, offering physical activity, allowing downtime for kids, certainly, and teachers are great at this, building in fun and laughter. Anything that we can do to kind of allow kids to continue to be kids, I think, is particularly important. And we want to keep encouraging kids to focus on what they can do versus what they can't do, or what they can control versus what they can't control. So if you flip through Tovah, I kind of think of this in terms of the M's. We want to help kids engage in movement, mindfulness, give them a sense of mastery, give them a sense of meaningful connection and connection both to adults and peers that can be good supports to them. Next slide, please. And time management. Some of the things that we see in kids and that we're hearing about with young kids, younger kids, there may be worries about social, academic, missed school. You can imagine starting school as a 6-year-old when you never went to kindergarten, developmental concerns, the child's anxieties. I think it's important as a parent and as educators and mental health practitioners to recognize that kids are incredibly resilient. They bounce back incredibly well. They're going to take their cues from us. And we want to sort of set the stage that we have every expectation that we can get them where they need to be, as well as keeping the eyes out for any early intervention that might be needed and to seek help as is needed. We also want to make sure that we get kids vaccinated, and work with families around vaccination if that's needed. Next slide, please. I love this slide. This was shared in a previous presentation that we actually did through Kids Mental Health Pierce County, and I borrowed it. So if you've seen it before, it was likely here. But I think this is really helpful, and I like that image of a telescope. I think, using our focus to help empower kids and teenagers and their sense of what they can do and how they can impact. So, this was really pandemic related, but you can easily translate this into other areas. So, during the time of restriction and when the pandemic was really in full rage, we couldn't control how others were following the rules of social distancing or how much toilet paper there was in the store or whether or not you could access gel. But we could control how much news we were watching, how much kids were on social media, what fun things there were that they could do at home, how we could structure the day. So I think it's important to continue to remind kids, and I work with teens and kids a lot and ask them, where's your lens right now? What are you focusing on? Are you focusing on things that are going to, perpetuate that sense of being out of control? Or are you focusing your lens on things that you can control? And sometimes I'll get a flashlight out and we'll focus in my office and kind of show that metaphorically for how that can work. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague to really kind of go more in depth about resources and strategies to address challenges that really can keep our kids and promote our kids' inner and internal resilience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I was just thinking about that activity, right? Using an actual flashlight to kind of show what that looks like. And I think even adults could probably glean some information from that too, because I know I have a hard time sometimes perseverating on the things that I can't control and trying to figure out how I could control them. And so Chris has really been focusing on what is going on with our youth. Why is this happening? Right. And then I'm going to kind of end us today with really talking about how can we support the youth that we work with, the youth that we live with. And all of the work that I do is really through this trauma-informed lens. For me, doing anything trauma-informed is just a good teaching practice, or it's just a good practice, right? It doesn't mean that the youth that we work with have to be impacted by trauma, but it's safe to say that COVID has created a chronic stressful experience for many youth. And so working with them and supporting them through this trauma-informed lens is going to be really helpful. And there's really 3 pillars to that. Thinking about how are we creating a safe environment? How are we building relationships and connectedness with them? And then how are we supporting and teaching emotional regulation, right? And something that Chris said earlier, even working or supporting her college age kids, right? That there's some of that maybe emotional regulation that is typically developed in high school years that wasn't developed, right? And we know that that's true for our middle school age kids, for our elementary age kids, and even for that pre-K age as well, that some of the emotional regulation, that developmental stages that they're learning through socialization with other individuals their age was missed over the last couple of years. And we know that as adults, when we are experiencing overwhelm, when we are experiencing some type of chronic stress or trauma, there are so many different ways that we manifest that it shows up for us. And the same goes with kiddos, right? Some of that anger that we might see, that sense of persecution, why me, right? It's always happening to me. I'm always the victim. Disassociating from challenging situations, right? There are so many different ways that fight, flight, and freeze that Chris was referencing show up for our kiddos. The first thing to talk about and to really understand when we are working with youth that are experiencing and showing strong emotions is that we want them to have a name for the emotion, right? They need to be able to name what is going on in their body. What are they feeling? And last year, Brene Brown had put out an HBO episode or an HBO series. And one of the things that she was researching is emotion and how we talk about emotion. And she, when asked, a handful of adults how many emotions they could name, it was 3, right? They can name when they're happy, when they're sad, and when they're angry. But in reality, there's something like almost 90 different emotions that we can experience on any given day. We don't always have the word for those emotions, right? And so for me, as a relatively regulated adult, when I experience frustration, oftentimes I am able to process that for myself when I'm able to determine what is making me feel a certain way. With young kids who do not have that skill yet, it's up to us to support them for how they can name it in order for them to what we call tame it, right? Figure out what's going on and put a plan into action. And one example, and I apologize that this is a little blurry, the term anxiety, right? We know that we are seeing such an increase in anxiety with our kids. And that means that it could be an upset stomach, right? They could blush really easily and then get embarrassed and then get upset and start crying, right? Not that that's ever happened to me before. They could experience sweaty palms, not being able to sleep, right? And so it's really important when we have kids that are exhibiting or starting to experience some of these physical emotions or physical ways that it's showing up, the physiological way that anxiety is showing up, that they're able to acknowledge and name, I'm experiencing anxiety right now. That's what's happening in my body. And we want them to be able to do that so that then that final part is what are they going to be able to do about it? What's the actual coping skill? We want to be able to stop and acknowledge, right? Stop and pause. What am I feeling? What's showing up in my body? Be able to name that feeling. This is anxiety showing up in my body. And then being able to get back into that nervous system to regulate it, right? Deep breaths is a great way to do that. And so being able to through and practice with kids about even just breath work is so important. This feeling wheel is actually from the Gottman Institute, which I'm a big fan of and use a lot of research that has come out of the Gottman Institute. But as you can see, right, the primary emotions that we feel or that we can name, I should say, there's actually so many different levels or types of that emotion, right? When we are mad, feeling critical actually feels very different than when we feel angry. Right? And so being able to slowly start integrating other feeling words with our kiddos is really important and really helpful. I work with a lot of youth also in special education. And one way to do that is also to make sure that there's a visual, that there's a face assigned with that word. And so there's a lot of, you can just Google that, right? The emotions, feeling emotions or emotions wheel. And there's a ton of resources that are free online for that. So a couple different wellness ideas, and this is to help decrease anxious feelings. And I will tell you that obviously this is directed for how are we supporting youth, but it works for adults too. And one of the things that's important to remember is that sometimes when we are experiencing anxiety and it's showing up and manifesting in our body, our kiddos that we are closest to are going to mirror that and vice versa. right? When our kids are experiencing and showing up with anxiety or showing up with different emotions, we might also start mirroring that behavior. And so it's really important to recognize that these wellness ideas are something that you can do as a classroom, as a family, right? One-on-one, as a social worker, to support yourself, but also to practice and support with kids, right? Scheduling mental time that is not screen time. That is so important, right? Coloring, reading for pleasure, going for a walk. I was working with a kid just earlier today, actually, that was pretty significantly escalated and having a really hard time. And when we were able to support the youth and re-regulate, the first thing that we suggested was a nature walk. Right? Get outside, ground yourself outside. Unfortunately, it also happened to be the first day that it was raining for how many months, but we took a nice, enjoyable walk today, and that really helped the youth re-regulate themselves, right? One of the things at home that can be powerful if this works for your schedule is committing to be present during a mealtime, right? And so really what that means is maybe dinner or maybe breakfast, and just having phones away and having screens away and engaging with your child, with your youth, and having some of those more vulnerable conversations. And then again, setting personal boundaries for yourself about screen time as well. I often work in schools where cell phones are challenging, right? How do we get our students off of phones? And then I go into classrooms and I see that sometimes the teachers are on their phone too, right? It's really hard to regulate screen time with youth if we're not regulating it for ourselves as well. Another thing that, and I'll walk us through one of these in particular, but there's a couple different breath work and just kind of mindfulness activities that you can walk your youth through. There's also amazing YouTube videos for this. I'm going to go over the contact points exercise because that's actually my personal favorite. But the 5 to 1 is also really nice because it helps kiddos start to focus on other things other than the anxiety or the stressors that they're feeling in their body. So here's a couple other examples. Again, you can find this activities of this on YouTube as well. But the context points exercise is a really helpful exercise because you can pretty much do it anywhere with a kiddo. All you need is a place for a youth to be able to sit, right? And so that's a chair, for example. And what you want to do, the contact points exercise is really going to strengthen your attentional control or the child's attentional control. And it's going to really slow the brain down. It's going to show your brain and nervous system that you're grounded, that you're stable, and that you're safe. Right? And so I do this in classrooms a lot. I will just personally tell you, I travel and I fly a lot for work. And so I am also a terrible flyer. I've always hated flying. And I do this every single time I'm on a plane. And it just regulates. It brings myself back into my body. I feel my feet on the ground because that's what you're doing. You're connecting and you're telling yourself, where are you feeling your body connected to the earth or connected to the object that you are seated at. A lot of this comes down to what does resiliency mean and what does resiliency look like? And I'm guessing that more research is going to come out about resiliency and building resiliency because of the COVID pandemic. We know that resiliency, some of it is inherent, right? We all are born with a certain level of resiliency, but a lot of it is built, right? We can develop our own resiliency. And the way that we do this, first and foremost, is validating. This is validating you, validating your youth. Right? You can do this through self-talk, for example. And I'll just give you, working with kids who escalate quite a bit, right? Who have really significant and oftentimes challenging behaviors. Telling myself when I'm in those situations, I do self-talk of just saying, this is not going to last forever. Right? There's going to be an end to this situation. And also I'll say, I'm not the one having a hard time. The kiddo's having a hard time right now, right? So I'm just reminding myself, like, I'm actually having a good day today. I'm here to support the youth. This isn't about me, right? So just validate where the kiddo's at. Giving and receiving compliments. There is a lot of research about how our mind changes when we are giving compliments. It feels good to receive, right? It doesn't always feel comfortable to receive, but how are we giving compliments and what does that look like? And prioritize the different areas of your health, right? And how are we celebrating the little things? How are we celebrating the silver linings, right? And the good times, the good experiences. When we are working with kiddos that are having a really hard time and coming back into the beginning of the school year can be really challenging for youth, communication and comfort is critical. And oftentimes we have to do this through nonverbal experiences. How are we supporting our youth with our facial features, right? How are we, our eye contact, our voice tone, our posture, right? Whenever I am realizing that maybe I'm not being the most supportive as I could, I pause myself. I tell myself to stop and take a deep breath. Because what I find is that if I'm not being as supportive, it's probably because I'm mirroring the stress cycle that the kiddo's in. I'm mirroring that escalation. And so just take a breath and do some of that self-talk. We want to make sure that the child's physical needs are being met, right? And just provide that emotional presence while we are helping the youth calm down. Validation is the most important thing in those moments, right? In those moments of dire need for our kiddos, right? We want to listen and respond to the youth's emotions and thoughts. We know as adults that emotions and feelings aren't always the most trustworthy thoughts that we have, right? And that's okay. In the moment is not the time to talk through that with the child. We want to validate. We want to be able to decode their larger experience, right? Maybe they're having a hard time and perseverating over this one worksheet. And what's the bigger picture? What's the bigger issue going on here? And when we restate what they're experiencing, their thoughts and feelings, we want to make sure that we don't have judgment while we're doing that. It's fact. It's always helpful to create space for the youth to share more, right? And so again, when we're kind of trying to decode the bigger picture, giving opportunity for the youth to share that bigger experience. And again, that avoidance of shaming or blaming. And truthfully, that is sometimes easier said than done, right? We need to be very cautious with what comes out of our mouth. And what we know about communication is that about 80% of it is not the words that we're saying, but how we are saying it. So we want to be sure that, sometimes we speak lower, we speak quieter. We want to make sure that we are being cognizant of how we are representing ourselves in the situation. And then reflect back to the youth. What was heard? What was shared? Place the behavior that was seen or that was observed and the situation in context. What was going on in the environment, right? Showing compassion and communicating support is going to be really important. We don't want to enable challenging behaviors, but we want to say, yes, this is a problem. And you know what? We can solve this together. I am here to support you and we are going to figure it out. And another really important way is to explore ways for us to repair, restore, and reconnect youth to those that are involved. Oh, and I see that there's a question, and maybe this is Vanessa, I saw your hand was raised, about the contact point exercise. And so I'll just really quickly go back and share the contact points exercise is really for us to be seated and to ground ourselves and to feel every point of our body that is grounded or that is touching the object that we are seated on, right? And so we're going through it with the child and we're saying, tell me what parts of your body can you feel are touching the chair? What parts of your body can you feel are touching the ground? And what this does is it actually takes the youth and that more high escalated or that fight flight state that they're in, and it connects the brain back to the nervous system. And so they're able to start regulating their breath again. So this is an activity that I've done with youth who are starting to experience, like, let's say, a panic attack. I've even done this, honestly, with youth who are starting to experience or are having an asthma attack, because oftentimes with that asthma attack, they start to increase their anxiety. And so you are focusing the youth and just helping them visualize what parts of their body are grounded. Hopefully that helps, but please feel free to ask again or ask for more details. So we want to make sure that we are helping youth restore any harm that has been done, any relationship challenges that have been had, right? And so talking through and processing with that, how did that make you feel? How do you think it made the other individual feel? What can we do to connect you again, right? To rebuild that friendship or rebuild that connection. This is a visual of just some different ways that we can incorporate self-care at home with kids, right? This can be done as a family. You can provide this to families that you work with, but it's just a fun way to have, to provide self-care that can be done within some type of family or caregiver unit. So there's connection with the child and the adults that they are living with. And Chris and I, we're going to open it up to questions, and we wanted to make sure that you all have access to these different resource hotlines for youth. And I'm sure you want to add something.
I do. You know, as we talked about the increase in depression and anxiety, what seems like a correlation with access, you know, unencumbered access to social media, and knowing really most importantly that kids, and it's usual that they would do this, right? Oftentimes they'll turn to other kids, particularly teenagers, before they turn to the adults in their lives. And so I have become a big fan that if your child or the children you work with are old enough to have cell phones, they're old enough and should be old enough to have crisis lines within their cell phones. And so, you know, I've done it with my kids. I would do it with my clients that I see here. I just think it's good, responsible practice to arm kids with resources so that if they have a friend or a teen or someone else that comes to them and they don't know what to do, they have something handy that we know is reputable that they can rely on and utilize. I also think when we talk about crisis and we think about kids in school coming back to school, it's always helpful to just sort of have an emergency plan for the what if. You know, some kids, it's like, but what if I do have this happen? What if that peer does say such and such? What if I do get an awful grade on that test, or I feel like I'm going to blow out of class? Can you come up with the first 3-step crisis plan and work with the school around, well, here's what we'll do. You'll work with your teacher. They already know this might happen. You'll excuse yourself. You'll go to the nurse's office. You'll call me, or whatever it might need to be. That can do a lot to de-escalate kids and to help them know and to predict what might come next. So we hate to take up any more of your time to ask us questions. I know we took up a lot of the time already. I'm so grateful for Tovah for all her amazing suggestions and strategies. I'm already thinking of what I might try with my kids at home. So thank you, Tovah. So I don't know, I think that our wonderful hosts can open up the chat line, or maybe they'll be moderating the questions, and we'll give you time for that.
Thanks, Tovah and Chris. This is Gina. I just wanted to let you know that we've had questions answered ongoing. Tovah called out a couple. The most recent I saw in the chat was somebody did want to give some gratitude and saying, thank you so much for having this. This has had great information, ideas, and it was very helpful. We do know that the chat's being a little uncooperative today. So if anybody else has any questions, if you want to put it in the Q&A portion, I'm happy to relay those to Tovah and Chris live.
The other thing is, as you're thinking about it and potentially putting questions in the chat, I wanted to echo something, or underscore, I should say, that Tovah mentioned that I think is so important. And that's that, you know, positive praise and positive feedback. And really the research would suggest that, you know, we are so much more inclined to hold on to and process the negative than the positive, to the ratio of 5 to 1, meaning you have to give 5 praise, compliments to really impact the same degree you would a negative remark, even if it's a subtle negative remark. And oftentimes I'll speak to people who might be working with kids that are presenting with challenging behaviors and say, you know, can you think of a few positives that you can point out? And, you know, I've certainly been there as well when you're that parent in the trenches and you're like, I'd love to point out something positive if they would do it. Well, I want to encourage you to remember that kids who have been hijacked by their emotions, just being there is positive. Not striking out 24/7 is positive. You know, not punching the kid next to them is positive. And no, I'm not suggesting that you say, thanks for not hitting Johnny, thanks for not hitting Julie, but you might say something like, I saw you the other day on the playground when you were feeling really frustrated, and I heard your voice get loud, and then I saw you go walk away. That was awesome. I know that that's really hard for you right now with how stressful things have been, and I just wanted you to know how great that is. Anything like that, you know, and they may not respond in the moment, but I guarantee you they're processing it and they're hearing it and it matters to them. So I want to encourage all of us to see, you know, the positive in our youth and to take a strengths-based approach about all the things that they're, you know, taking in the world and how much they're working to thrive.
Yeah, Chris, I just want to piggyback off of that. The Gottman Institute has a lot of amazing research about that positive reinforcement, essentially, right? That verbal praise. And it's interesting because I work with schools to implement that, but it did not start at schools. It really started with the Gottman Institute, and they predominantly research, you know, relationships, marriage and family relationships. And what they say is that we need a 5-to-1 ratio of positive verbal praise to every corrective comment that we make to a child. And that's where we see behavioral change. And so I use this language and I use this in my everyday work with schools. But what's fascinating is that the research started as with married couples, right? And so couples that are more likely to stay married and not divorce have that 5-to-1 ratio. So if you're coupled, right, everybody's like going home to make sure you increase that 5-to-1 ratio. But it's fascinating because what works with youth, we know it's behavioral science. What works with youth is going to work with adults too, and vice versa, right? It's going to look different probably because of developmental stages, but we know that we can support each other and support the kids that we are working with or the kids that we live with through positive praise, through verbal praise.
So Tova and Chris, I know that we're bumping right up against time, and ask and you shall receive. We've got some really great questions here in the chat. I don't know capacity of people to stay on past 4, but could you perhaps give any indication on if we could share these PowerPoint slides or your contact information afterwards so that maybe perhaps people can follow up with you? I know it's here on the screen, your titles, but I don't think we quite have your contact information on the slide.
Yeah, I'm certainly fine to have people reach out to me. And I see that Tovah's information is in there, and that's probably the best place to put it, right? Is I'll put it in the chat. So let me figure out. Oh, you got it already. Thank you. That's the wonderful piece. And I'm seeing there's some really good questions in here. What do you think the long-term mental health impacts would be if you force an autistic teen with significant mental health challenges, PTSD, history of development involving 5-year documents, due to severe anxiety and mental health issues? That is a huge question. That is probably not a question to try to answer in the short term, but I would be more than happy to help think that through. Looks like that was a question you put through, Emily. We do know that kids on the spectrum and kids that have, you know, that are have developmental challenges, that have developmental delay, that are intellectually disabled, had huge impact from the pandemic. A lot of loss of paraprofessional support, a lot of challenge being home without some of the structure and the routines that they were used to. And we've seen huge impact and profound impacts actually to those kids. Happy to chat if you want to reach out to me. Also saw the comment about the positive around Discord server, and absolutely, I don't want to misspeak by saying that social media is all bad. It's not all bad. I think what I want to do is I want to encourage all of us to be mindful about like anything, the hands that we're putting it in, and we want to educate as we help them grow. And so I think just teaching them to be wise consumers like we do of other things, really, is everybody's vacation perfect? Do you think that child that looks all put together doesn't have a hard day, just like you have a hard day? I mean, things along those lines. But I also think it allows kids to connect with other kids, and particularly at a time when they couldn't.
Yeah, right now, what it's the information out is that the news channel that kids are accessing the majority of the news from is TikTok, right? And so that's just a good reminder of how are we supporting our kids accessing the right information rather than potentially misinformation.
I see one more question that Tovah would like to answer, or possibly would like to answer before we wrap things up. I know we're a couple minutes over, but I do want to do that. Someone asked about having examples of conversations is the best way for me to understand how to talk or say things to my children. I'm wondering if you can just provide a couple of examples for how to start those conversations for this participant.
Yeah, and I see Kimberly type that in, and my emails, all of our emails are in the chat, and so I also have like PDF documents of different sentence starters and different communication starters. But I always go back to the way we have to do this is not start with the bad situation, right? And so this always starts with just doing regular, and again, making it structured, making it routine, check-ins with your kids, right? And so usually, for example, if you are a parent, it's when they get home from school and you're all in the kitchen together. As a teacher, right, maybe it's right at the door as they're entering and you're just doing like a fist bump and a check-in with them, because that's really going to help kind of set the tone of where are they at, right? Like doing a temp check essentially of how is your child and where are they at typically, like when they're not escalated and when they're baseline. And that's where you can then lean into some deeper conversations with your youth, right? And so again, that's pretty dependent on the situation, but just asking, how's school going? What's one exciting thing that happened at school today? I do this oftentimes with the rose, the bud, and the thorn, right? So give me a rose, give me a good experience from school, give me a bud, right? Something you're hoping to like grow into or something you're excited about that's coming up. And then a thorn, tell me something that was like pretty icky from school today or something not as fun from school today, right? And of course, you would use language dependent on the age of the kids that you're working with. So I wouldn't say icky necessarily to a high school student, for example. And so just starting out with the relationship building first and making it a norm rather than making it, oh, I only talk to you about this when bad things are happening.
I love that comment. I know a family that used to do, and actually one of my kids' friends came over and had dinner. This was some time ago, but their thing at dinner time was best part of the day, worst part of the day. And they would just go around at dinner time, and that led to all kinds of interesting tales and stories. And so we adopted it after that. So yeah, there's lots of great ways to just, normalize having conversation about all those different emotions that we all feel throughout the day.
Thank you so much. I think this was incredibly valuable, and I'm so grateful for your collaboration and connection. I will have this posted on the Kids Mental Health Pierce County website shortly, but I want to thank all the participants. I want to thank Dr. Ladish and Tovah for participating and for being good collaborators and advocates for our young people and families. It takes us all to support one another and our young people. Definitely know that now more than ever. So thank you everyone for participating, and thank you Tovah and Chris. We'll have the emails posted as well, and feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions or comments that you have following.
Thank you for inviting us to speak together. It was our pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, you guys, for running